Let's talk about the best and worst of the accursed engines and the Forsworn heroes with a tier list of Chaos Knights units in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're delving into Index Chaos Knights once more and talking through each and every unit in the army and roughly how I'd rank it in game for power at the moment. In this video I'm going to do a short tier list, ranking all the Chaos Knights into 4 different tiers, talking through each unit and why I'd rank it where I would in terms of competitive play in Warhammer 40k 10th at the moment. While we're on the subject of Chaos Knights, I thought I'd just quickly mention the Knight Household giveaway that I'm doing on the channel for the start of September. This one's going to be a fairly big one, with 3 people each winning a custom Knight Household, either Imperial or Chaos as you prefer, either any 3 plastic big knights of your choice, though you can swap any of them out for 4 Armigers or 4 War Dogs. As per normal, the ways to enter are either on the Facebook page or the Patreon page. I'll talk about this in a bit more in detail at the end of the video if you'd like to catch up there for some more details. In any case, in 40k 10th edition, I'd argue that Chaos Knights aren't doing too badly right now. As army strength goes, they're fairly middle of the pack, around about a 40% win rate at grand tournaments and things. Pretty capable of dispatching a bunch of the armies that are struggling more in Warhammer 40k at the moment. They do have big chunky stat lines and put lots of wounds and damage on the table, but for the most part struggling to win tournaments somewhat, and there's certainly not particularly awesome balance between the Chaos Knights and their Imperial cousins, who are doing a little bit better with a win rate around about 55%, mainly just due to having a bit more raw power in their index between powerful bondsman abilities and their core rules just giving them a bunch more standard damage and defense as opposed to relying on battle shock to get jobs done. I feel like a few of the Towering Chaos Knights copped a nerf that they didn't really need all that much when Games Workshop just increased the points cost of most Towering gun units in the game. I feel like they probably should have used the opportunity to hit Chaos Knights a little bit less hard than their Imperial cousins to even up the gap a bit. Even so, they're still definitely not doing too badly, definitely an army that you can do well with, and struggling far less than many in Warhammer 40k. In this video we'll talk through each unit in turn. I've ranked them into 4 slightly arbitrary tiers of rough power level at the moment in my opinion. I've also looked over a good number of tournament lists and done a community poll for power levels of each unit to try and guide things a bit better. Obviously any one person's playstyle might vary a bit, and a few of these could certainly vary depending on the meta, depending on whether you're fighting more enemy knights or big heavy vehicles, or have a lot more elite infantry and hordes to deal with. In any case though, at the moment, let's talk through each and every unit in the index and the Forge World index, and roughly how strong I rate them at the moment. First up, for Tier 4 for the army, I'd argue that these are perhaps some of the weaker datasheets out of the index. Here I've chosen to rank the Abominant alongside the Acheron, Moirax, and the Questor, Magyra, and Styrex. I think the translation to 10th edition has been a bit unfortunate for the Abominant. It's 455 points, and that gets you a big Volkite and Psychic Knight, though unfortunately compared with its peers I do think it's just a bit overcosted for what it really brings to the table. It does have some fairly strong melee into elite infantry, but it's going to struggle against things like toughness 11 or 12 vehicles, far more than a bunch of the other knights on the list, and its ranged weapon is really let down by being AP 0. You're very reliant on getting 6s to devastating wound the enemy, which occasionally you might roll hot on, but you might just roll none, and its shooting might utterly whiff. Otherwise, both of its abilities are useful, but not game-changing, I think. Being able to hand out a battle shock test in the shooting phase is definitely good for Chaos Knights, so many of their things get a lot better against battle shocked units, and that could be really big if you can force an opponent to fail a test. Just generating a single test though isn't the be all and end all, and the opponent might just pass it though. It's also got an mortal wound aura debuff that happens after he moves. Not too bad to have in the centre of the enemy army if you can get it there, but for the most part it's going to be doing chip damage as opposed to wiping out any units, and even then unreliably. Finally, the Psychic keyword could be a bit of a liability against some opponents. There are plenty of weapons in the game that are anti-Psyker X, and it means against some foes this guy's just going to go down perhaps unusually easily for a big Titanic Knight. Overall, I would say that he needs a bit of a points drop compared with his peers. Kind of sad to have quite such a cool model being a bit underpowered relatively, I think. Next up, we've got the Chaos Sarastas Acheron Knight for 465 points. This one's the one with the flamethrower and does some battle shock things. The Sarastas chassis is quite nice, having faster movement and 25 wounds rather than 22, but this one's probably the worst of the bunch, I'd say. The flame cannon just feels a bit underpowered with just 2d6 strength 8 and damage 2. Not awesome for a primary knight weapon that needs to get close, and it does remove cover from the enemy target, but that's just not really quite enough when it's the primary weapon on a 465 point model. Otherwise, it's got another Battle Shock ability, but again, kind of unhelpful to deliver. You need to have War Dogs in melee within 6 inches of that knight, and that just feels like a very clunky and hard to deliver mechanic. You need to be charging alongside a friendly War Dog. Sometimes it's just not going to be convenient, or one or the other is going to fail its charge, and even then it's not a ridiculously good buff even if you do pull it off. Overall, not useless, could be okay for Overwatch, but again I feel like it's outcompeted pretty solidly by many of the other knight classes. Next for 170 points is the Wardog Moirax. I feel like this guy is perhaps particularly underpowered in Chaos Knights compared with the Imperials perhaps. For the Imperials they don't really have quite as much choice of gear. Could be a bit more interesting to have a more dedicated anti-horde armager, or get the big d6 plus 2 damage melee weapon which neither of them get on their standard armagers. But that's not something that any of the Chaos Knight War Dogs struggle for, so I feel like it's just a lot more outcompeted when you've got so many choices. It also doesn't get a Stubber or a Havoc launcher, and its special rule is a fairly weak one as well, being a free heroic intervention, which is kind of situational compared with the damage buffs a lot of the other War Dogs get. I feel like this is very rarely going to be the best choice compared with a bunch of the other War Dogs on offer. Finally, for the units that are ranked in the lowest positions here, we've got the Questor Maghera and the Questor Styrix. Again, compared with the other abhorrent classes, these guys just don't really seem very exciting. They do have a few selling points, including getting their invulnerable saves in melee as well as at range. Their aura buffs allow War Dogs to ignore modifiers, which is helpful in some matchups, but a lot less predictably good than a bunch of the other auras that you have on offer, say the Desecrator one or the Castigator one. And then depending on the variant, you either get to slow movement or regenerate wounds, and their primary ranged weapons are AP 0, the same as the Abominant, making them super unreliable against high save opponents. Again, like the rest of the ones that I'd rank here, could probably do with a points cut to make them a bit more relevant. Moving on to tier 3, I'd say that these ones are going to be a bit niche or overshadowed in most armies. They perhaps have a bit more of a niche than the ones that are ranked in tier 4. Here I've chosen to rank the Acastus class knights and the Atropos. All of these seem to be pretty excellent if you happen to be fighting enemy heavies or enemy knights in particular, but if they're not going to be particularly regular things that you're fighting on the battlefield, they're probably going to be a bit too much points compared with other knights. Starting out with the Acastus class knights, there's the Porphyrion at 740 points and the Asterius at 840. These ones are the really big knights with truly enormous anti-tank weapons, big bulky toughness 13, 30 wound profiles. The Porphyrion has the Magna las cannons with d6 enormous damage 6 shots, and the Asterius with its conversion beamers gets even more ridiculous damage than that, averaging something around the lines of 40 odd wounds to most vehicles that it takes aim at. If you happen to be fighting enemy knights or super heavies on the other side of the board, these guys could definitely be worth their weight in gold and help you win a direct knight fight. But if you play against opponents who might be able to hide their units, or just have a lot of medium or lighter infantry that aren't going to care as much about weapons that have got enormous damage characteristics, then they're probably going to be a bit overcosted for what they do in those games. At this sort of points cost, they are an enormous chunk of the army, and there's still some armies that could kill them a bit easier than you'd really like. Definitely not unusable though, they're definitely going to be a big challenging threat on the other side of the table for your opponent, though I feel like a few armies could manage the matchup with that without too much difficulty. The other one I've ranked here is the Cerastus Knight Atropos, the one with the Las Cutter and the Grav Singularity Cannon. This one I'd rank a little bit better than the Acheron for being a bit more of a general all-rounder. Its weapons are okay at killing elite infantry, but again it's one that only really excels if the opponent's got enemy knights or towering Titanic vehicles on the other side of the table, as it gets some big boosts against them with +1 to hit and wound, and it also gives War Dogs rerolls against anything with Titanic or towering, so it's going to be massively important in any games with enemy super heavies. It also has the fast movement of the Cerastus and a 5+ invulnerable save in melee as well, both of which are really quite nice advantages. And again, like the Acastus ones, I'd probably rank it as pretty excellent in the right matchup, but in some games it's just going to be fairly heavily outcompeted, just with its weapon profiles in comparison to the other ones that you might have had. Still though, probably towards the upper end of tier 3, maybe could have been a tier 2 choice if I was feeling generous. Next up in tier 2 we've got the units that I rate as solidly usable Chaos Knight datasheets. Starting out we've got the Knight Tyrant at 555 points. These are the big chunky Dominus Knights with a toughness 13, a big 24 wounds and a 2+ save. Unlike their Imperial cousins as well, they can take the thing that ignores 1 pip of AP in the enemy army, and that could be really quite nice stats with the 2+ armor. A lot of, say, AP2 weapons aren't going to do much against these guys, particularly if you can nose them into cover very slightly. You can't take that on the Acaster Knights as they don't get character keywords. Then for weapons, it comes with melter guns and a bunch of carapace weapons, plus either the option of the more Castellan or the more Valiant pattern versions, either Big Flamer and Harpoon, or Volcano Lance and Plasma Decimator. I feel like with the stats that it's got at the moment, the two variants are at least fairly well balanced depending on what you want more of. The Valiant pattern with the Flamer is really quite nice to stomp up towards a midfield objective, and then it's got a 12-inch denied deep strike rule, which is quite handy if it's on there. Should be pretty good for defending those objectives, particularly with a massive Overwatch threat. That same denied deep strike could be pretty handy on a home field objective though. You could have it sitting there and just blasting enemy tanks at range with Volcano Lancers and Plasma. Its stats really are big hitting just in their own right, even if it doesn't get all that many other buffs or synergies. Otherwise, for its special rule, it gets an Infernal Aegis to provide the benefit of cover to nearby war dogs within 6 inches. I guess that could allow you to be a bit more freeing with the positioning of those. In 10th edition, it's often not the hardest to get cover saves for vehicles anyway, but it could be helpful for some. Overall, solid enough for the stats. I'd say maybe not one of the absolute top data sheets, but still very, very usable. Next up, for 480 points, is the Knight Castigator, a fast-moving and hard-hitting Cerastus Knight. This one's primary weapon is the rather brutal twin-linked Gatling cannon, a fairly murderous 18 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, and twin-linked allows you to re-roll the wound roll so it punches up against heavier targets a lot better than, say, the Despoiler ones do. It's particularly nasty for chewing through 2 wound Space Marines, though it's quite nicely general purpose. It's also got really quite a good aura buff for nearby war dogs, giving them sustained hits on a 6. Pretty handy for advancing alongside things like Stalkers or having Brigands nearby. Overall, I'd still probably say it's not one of the single most standout Chaos Knights. I feel like a lot of the bigger ones you kind of hope they might do a little bit more against enemy heavies, but I feel like it's a very strong and usable one still. A good gun, good melee, and a nice sustained hits buff for war dogs. Hard to go too far wrong with those, they're all quite good. Next up, for 135 points, we've got the Wardog Executioner, so the more Helverin pattern armature type one with the auto cannons. They get 8 shots at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3, and they're perhaps best used as some really quite cheap backfield fire support that doesn't have to get too close to the enemy, compared with say the Wardog Brigand that wants to get within 24 inches. I think it does its job very well for 135 points. It's one of the ones that you could have just holding down a home field objective, or maybe just doing a bit of screening. They're still quite fast moving and have reasonable enough objective control. A special rule might help from time to time, being a +1 to hit against below half strength units, though I feel like that's one of the slightly more niche ones out there. Overall, in terms of direct firepower damage, I think I'd rely on Brigands to do more of the heavy lifting, though 1 or 2 of these in the backfield seems like a pretty reasonable idea given how cheap they are and their long range. Finally in Tier 2, for 395 points, we've got the Knight Rampager. He is the cheapest big knight of the bunch. Fairly enormous hard-hitting melee damage, hitting on a 2+ with a brutal 6 attacks, sustained hits 1 on the charge, and also the choice of profiles between all sorts of different ones depending on your targets. He's got the massive damage A to the Warp Strike Claw. If you're tangling with enemy heavies, I could choose either damage 3 or damage 2 attacks to take out different flavours of elite infantry. He's also got a single advance and charge per game, which is really quite huge. It gives him a rather massive 20 inches average charge threat range, something that the opponent might be kind of hard pressed to ignore. When he's there as well, he might also give out some rerolls for nearby war dogs in combat as well, though I'd say again that's one of the buffs that's a little bit harder to pull off than others and isn't enormously meaningful if you do. Main disadvantage is that he's a dedicated melee knight and might just get screened or clatter against something unimportant and then be in a position for the enemy to hit him back very hard. It's still maybe not the most terrible thing in the world, seeing as he is the cheapest of the big knights, so if anything is going to absorb fire, it might be best to be him. Kind of a shame to have a lack of auto-explode or fights in death or things. Both of those will be quite nice for the Rampager. Moving on, we get to Tier 1 and some of the strongest Chaos Knight units around, though I have included one more as a bonus entry ranked above this one. First up, for 160 points, we have the brutal melee threat that is the Wardog Carnivore. This guy went from being the cheapest to one of the most expensive of the war dogs, but still hits absolutely enormously hard. 6 attacks hitting on a 2+ with a choice of different profiles. That scary Slaughter Claw with d6+2 damage is enormous, and it averages around about 15 wounds against most toughness 10 vehicles, usually around about 3 failed saves. You could also back that up with Tank Shock as well if you did just absolutely want to murder something. It's got a 14-inch move and gets to reroll charges, so again is very reliable to get there. That's an average 22-inch charge threat range without any additional buffs. It's not impossible, you could just make flat out first turn charges with this thing if the enemy deploys on the line. It might also be a good surprise one to use that walk through walls type stratagem as well, which might let you have better charge options than you might have had otherwise. I'd still say that despite it being really quite strong, it's probably not one to go too mad on. Maybe somewhere around 1 to 3 of them in the front rank might be a bit more optimal, otherwise you might start to get into diminishing returns with too many things trying to charge the same unit at once, or melee knights getting in each other's way. For a couple of very scary distraction card effect style charge threat units, I think that these guys are pretty excellent though. Next up, for perhaps some of the main powerhouse units of Index Chaos Knight are the War Dog, Stalker, and Huntsman. I think probably just worth talking about together as they're kind of just two different slight flavours on pretty much the same datasheets. Usually going to be packing a Demon Breath Spear in the one arm for some solid anti-tank, and then some melee damage of some description in the other. Although it's not the way that everyone likes to play Chaos Knights, some competitive lists certainly do go for mass War Dogs or even 100% War Dogs. These guys are pretty much the choices to have on the battle line for that. Range threats that are going to chip away at the enemy, and massive charge threat if the enemy gets too close while they're scrapping over midfield objectives. I'd say out of the two, probably the Stalker is the more mainstay one, perhaps the slightly better one for the cost. It's very slightly cheaper at 5 points off, and I'd say the Slaughter Claw is probably the one that I prefer to go to for the most part for the combat weapon. Getting strength 12 and damage d6 plus 2 means that it's absolutely terrifying against single wound targets, and still should kill a fair few infantry and threaten better tank shock as well. I do quite like the +1 to wound it gets against isolated foes as well, which maybe is a little bit situational but very meaningful when it comes up. Depending on how you want to field them as well, you do have the option of the chain cannon if you just need a bit more anti-horde compared with anti-tank. You get the character keyword if you need an enhancement, and can take the Havoc launcher for a bit of indirect fire. The Huntsman is maybe a bit more simple, just being the same as the Armored Warglaive for the Imperials. That one gets a damage boost against monsters and vehicles with re-rolling wound and damage results of 1. That really is a powerful rule that makes the Demon Breath Spear a lot more scary against those kind of targets. I feel that one's pretty reasonable if you want to make it a bit more of an anti-tank shooting knight, and then still a fairly general purpose melee combatant, but a bit more skewed towards medium or lighter infantry. Next up, we've got the cheapest big knight bar the Rampager, which is the Desecrator. This one's the unique Chaos Knight with the great big laser destructor, an utterly terrifying anti-tank gun that hits on a 2+, a strength 18, AP loads, and damage d6 plus 3. Still can be a bit unreliable, as most vehicles you'd be wounding on a 3+, but it does also have devastating wounds as well, so every so often you're just going to punch through a whole bunch of mortal wounds, no questions asked. Overall, I think that's a very solid primary weapon for this kind of points cost. It's got a very useful aura of rerolling ones for ranged war dogs nearby as well. That one's quite nice to support stalkers moving forward towards the enemy, or maybe some war dog brigands trailing in its wake. Then it's got some fairly standard knightly melee weapons with either the chainsword or the claw. It's still going to be a very big threat there as well. Really quite a nice all-rounder, and quite a nice one to have in a list that's going fairly heavy on war dogs with that nice reroll aura. Next up, we've got the Chaos Knight Lancer, really quite an interesting choice, as while it does lack one powerful ability for advance and charge that the Imperials get, this one is significantly cheaper at 465 points, which is definitely no bad thing for a dedicated melee knight that's going to be taking the brunt of enemy fire. As a Cerastus class, it moves very quickly and gets a +2-inch movement on that, so a big 14-inch movement to hurtle across the table with. And when it gets to combat, it's got kind of similar sort of melee threats to the Rampager, if a little bit less flexible, plus bonus tank shock as well, which you're quite likely to get a full 6 mortal wounds out of. And between that and its conventional damage, it's going to make a mess of just about anything. As a Cerastus, it gets slightly more wounds as well, and most importantly, it gets that enormous 4+ invulnerable save both at range and in melee. That does make it enormously more survivable, and you never have to pay command points to use that diabolic bulwark stratagem either. And it's particularly good to get it in combat where the big knights tend to be a bit easier to kill. Otherwise, it gets a little bit of close range shooting with that shock lance, though nothing enormous, and also might help a little bit by giving nearby war dogs the assault keyword for their weapons. That could be pretty handy for stalkers trying to move up the board quickly, still snapping off a few shots with those Demon Breath Spears. I feel like with the enormous invulnerable save, it probably is worth the extra points over the Rampager for the most part at the moment, though again does have some of the same weaknesses, such as being screened out by enemy chaff units, and it's maybe going to struggle to justify itself unless it can get into some good stuff at some point in the game. Finally, for the stronger classes of Chaos Knight, there's also the Knight Despoiler at 470 points. This one I think is pretty strong just purely for the stats of the standard knight shooting weapons. Likely the best armed weapons in my opinion is some combination of battle cannons or Gatling cannons. I think it is kind of cool that it gets to dual wield two of the same if it really wants to. You could get 36 strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 shots out of one. And that's just some very very scary general purpose damage output that most units are going to struggle to stand against. The battle cannon's good as well though, does get lower AP but higher strength and higher damage plus the blast keyword. I think mixing and matching it isn't a terrible idea. On top of that you do get the carapace guns, most likely a rocket pod with d6 damage is the best choice, and then you do have a lot of flexibility with the other options if you want to tailor knights to one purpose or another, having most combinations of the range and melee weapons if you want a bit more of a general purpose one. Otherwise though, I would say that its inbuilt special rules maybe aren't the most exciting in the world. It just gets a single reroll per attack, not particularly meaningful on the high rate of fire weapons that are probably its best choices, and its aura boost to the war dogs is a fairly bad one I think in making battle shock a little bit better. Occasionally could be handy enough, but a bit less useful compared with just raw damage or defensive ones I think. I think it probably does enough to justify itself though just based on the raw damage output of its guns, even if it might be looking on a bit enviously at the Imperial Knight Crusader, which I would say has access to some far more meaningful buffs than this guy does. Finally though, I decided just to call one knight out for special mention over and above tier 1, and that's the very very efficient gun turret that is the Wardog Brigand for 150 points, striding about the board very quickly and laying low its foes with Demon Breath Spear and Avenger Chain Cannon. I think these guys are being pretty close to being an auto-include unit for Chaos Knights at the moment. I've certainly seen some lists that go heavy on War Dogs spamming a full 6 of these as they are battle line. Just all round strong and pretty much exactly what you want for taking and receiving blows with the enemy army. Their firepower hits on a 2+, so they're very resilient to things like modifiers or degrading. I've already mentioned that the Demon Breath Spear is just a very nice weapon for anti-armor, strength 12 and damage d6 with 2 shots with a melt of 4 special rule, so if you get close to enemy vehicles it's particularly murderous. Then chased down by 12 fairly good quality anti-infantry shots at strength 6 and AP 1, a whole bunch of stubber fire, potentially 6 shots at 18-inch range, and then if it does happen to be firing at the closest eligible targets, then you get bonus AP. A bit less relevant on the already very good AP of the Demon Breath Spear, but really really good on the chain cannon and stubber at helping them clear out infantry efficiently. Otherwise, for all that good stuff, it's not really significantly more expensive than most of the other war dogs, has fast moving and good objective control like the others, and I feel like a lot of the buffs in the army are just particularly good for it. It's really quite nice for the Desecrator or the Castigator's auras for better range damage, and it could be quite a good one for that Dreadhound stratagem, where if you focus a whole bunch of fire on one unit, you get some sustained hits, potentially on a 5+ if you can make that enemy unit a battle shocked one. I feel like at the moment including about as many of these as you want is far from a bad choice, backed up by some combination of some of the other war dogs and maybe a big knight or two out of the tier 1 units. In any case though, let me know what you make of the Chaos Knight units, which ones have been working well for you in game at the moment, and which of them are most in need of a buff from Games Workshop when the next balance pass comes around. Before I finish though, I thought I'd just mention that Knight Household giveaway that I'm doing once more, and talk through how to enter if you'd like to be in the running to get a new household of Chaos Knights or Imperials. As mentioned, the prize is for one of 3 custom Knight households, choosing any 3 of the big knights produced by Games Workshop in plastic, either Imperial or Chaos, and any single big knight can be swapped for either 4 armigers or war dogs. As per normal with the channel giveaways, there's 2 ways to enter, links down in the video description. Either support the channel on Patreon for any amount, that gets you automatic entry into the giveaways each and every month, or support the channel on social media completely for free. To do that, you subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the Facebook page, and then to actually enter the draw, a giveaway post appears on the channel's Facebook page on the 1st of September 2023. Reply to that post with a picture of any 40k mini or imagery, along with your name and the date handwritten within the same photo. The last bit's just to deter Facebook bots and spammers and ensure that the prizes go to real people. Then, after all the entries are in, there's 1 entry per person, and I do the draw with a random number generator and announce it on the channel update video on YouTube around about the 4th of September 2023. I'll then get in touch with the 3 people who've won, ask them which knights they'd like, and then the models will be posted after I receive them. There might be a bit of a delay if Games Workshop are slow in having them in stock or anything. Hopefully they'll sort their War Dog supply issues at some point or another. In any case though, if you want to enter for that in either way, the links are down in the video description, and there are other further similar scale giveaways each and every month on the channel. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the Warhammer 40k videos coming, and there'll be new ones out just about every day. There are a few other benefits for joining the channel's Patreon as well, things like getting your name in the credits for bigger supporters, seeing new videos a bit earlier before other people, and voting on the regular polls to see what sort of things I make next on the YouTube videos. If any of that's interesting, or you just want to enter the giveaway or something, the link's down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.